The first person to see the bobcat thought it was after the fish guts in the bin. That was the easiest explanation at 5:18 in the morning, when the river launch still belonged to mist, wet wood, and the hard metallic silence that comes just before an outdoor place starts pretending to be friendly. Cedar Bend Outfitters sat on the inside curve of the river where the current slowed enough for kayaks, lesson groups, and weekend paddlers who underestimated weather to put in with confidence and get humbled downstream. By daylight, the place looked almost idyllic. Colorful boats stacked on cedar racks, a little check-in shack with trail maps and sunscreen for sale, picnic tables under sycamores, a long sand and gravel launch tapering into green-brown water. But before sunrise, it was just river and equipment. The rental signs looked flimsy. The racks cast long, cage-like shadows. The mist off the water erased the opposite bank. The current made low sucking sounds around the dock pilings, and every rope knot dripped steadily into the morning. The kayak rack stood nearest the river path, a three-tier wooden frame beside the sand where the red and blue sit-on tops were stored for quick launch. That was where the bobcat was waiting, not in the reeds by the parking lot, not moving through the brush strip along the trail, not slipping away into the cottonwoods when headlights brushed the launch road. It sat on the sand beside the kayak rack, body low, ears sharply tufted, pale, tawny fur darkened in places by dew, eyes fixed not on the river itself, but on the strip of wet shoreline beside the first rack post. Claire Dugan saw it as she came down the ramp with two paddles under one arm and a thermos of coffee under the other. At 36, Claire was the senior river guide for Cedar Bend, which meant she spent her life trying to make water look safer than it really was, without ever lying about what it could do. She ran dawn birding paddles, beginner classes, rescue refreshers, and the kind of late summer kid groups that made liability insurers develop blood pressure issues. Years on the river had trained her to notice things quickly. A different sound in the current, a branch where no branch had been the day before, fresh boot prints below the tide line after a night nobody should have been there. In water work, details mattered because they were often the only warning you got. So when she saw a bobcat sitting in the open by the launch before dawn and not moving, she felt her body react before her thoughts caught up. "Oh no," she whispered. The animal turned its head and looked at her, then toward the sand by the rack. That was the first wrong thing. The second was that it didn't leave. Claire had seen wildlife near the river all the time. Herons, raccoons, foxes. Once a black bear crossing the far bank in spring flood season. Bobcats rarer but not impossible in the river corridor. She had found tracks in the mud after rain. One of the younger guides swore he saw one slipping along the willow line at dusk in September. But those sightings all shared a basic rule. The wild thing noticed the human and chose absence. This one chose the launch. She took one slow step forward. The bobcat backed up a few feet into the shadow of the rack, then stopped again and looked at the same patch of sand. Not random, Claire thought immediately. Not random at all. The river around them was still only half visible. A low bank of fog drifted over the current, breaking around the dock pilings and the anchored lesson pontoon in slow ghostly folds. The sand held the night's dampness. The sycamore leaves overhead clicked softly in the breeze. Nothing moved except the bobcat and the river. Then the animal stood, crossed 3 paces to the waterline, and stared at the sand. Claire followed its line of sight. At first she saw only the ordinary clutter of a riverside launch. Wet footprints from yesterday's cleanup, a paddle drip mark, a gull feather, one overturned orange life jacket bin waiting to be righted. Then she saw the disturbed sand. A long scraped channel ran from the edge of the water up toward the kayak rack. Not deep, not machine-made, not a simple footprint trail, a drag mark, fresh enough that the edges still held shape where the damp sand had been displaced. Her mouth went dry. She set the paddles down very slowly and crouched. Now that her eye had the pattern, other details emerged. Heel marks, bare handprints. One place where the drag line widened abruptly as if something or someone had rolled or tried to push up. A smear of darker wetness just above the waterline. Not obviously blood. Maybe mud. Maybe not. The bobcat paced once along the edge of the mark and sat again. Claire stood up too fast and almost sloshed the coffee from the thermos still in her hand. "Damon!" she shouted toward the guide shed. A light flipped on inside almost immediately. Damon Wells, outfitter owner, ex-whitewater instructor, and a man who had built an entire life out of underreacting to chaos until it was fully in front of him, stepped out zipping his fleece. He was 48, broad-shouldered, river-tan, and habitually calm enough to irritate everyone around him. "What?" she pointed. He looked at the bobcat first, then at the sand, then at Claire's face. His tone changed instantly. "What happened?" "I don't know," she said. "But look." They both moved closer to the drag mark. Damon's eyes dropped to the sand and stayed there. "Well," he said after a beat, "that's not from one of ours." "No kidding." The bobcat had shifted now to the edge of the first rack support, watching not them, but the line where the disturbed sand met the willow shadows beyond the launch. Damon crouched and ran one finger beside the drag groove without touching it. Fresh. Deep enough in places to say weight, not driftwood. Not made by current because the river had not reached that high in days. There were shoe prints too, small, and then none. "That goes up from the water," Claire said. Damon nodded grimly. Then he saw what she hadn't yet, a bright strip caught under the low branch of the nearest willow sapling, where the drag line bent slightly toward the reeds. He reached carefully and pulled free a piece of nylon webbing, a child-sized life vest strap, cut or torn loose. Neither of them spoke for a second. The bobcat made a short, rough sound in its throat and turned sharply toward the willows. Claire's pulse kicked hard. There was someone here, or there had been very recently. Someone came up out of the river. Someone small enough to wear a youth vest. Someone who had dragged themselves, or been dragged, up the launch and into the river grass. Damon was already on the phone to 911 before she finished the thought. Possible river rescue. Fresh drag marks at launch. Child flotation strap. Unknown victim. Need sheriff, EMS. River patrol now. The dispatcher's voice lost all softness immediately. Claire took 2 slow steps toward the willow line. "Wait," Damon snapped. She stopped, because he was right. The brush along that bank looked open from 10 feet away and became a tangle of roots, reeds, soft mud, and undercut pockets the closer you got. It was exactly the kind of place a rescuer could break an ankle, spook an injured child deeper, or destroy the only useful tracks before law and rescue ever saw them. So they waited. Not idly, never idly. Damon grabbed the throw bag, trauma kit, and launch keys. Claire cut the dock lights to reduce glare on the water. One of the junior guides came running down from the shed and was immediately ordered back up to the road to stop any early customers from entering the launch. And through all of it, the bobcat remained by the rack. Not close now. It had moved with them, always keeping a line of sight on the drag marks and the willow shadow where they disappeared. The sheriff's first unit arrived in under 8 minutes, then county EMS, then river patrol with a John boat trailer still hooked because nobody had bothered to unhitch after the previous night's call. Deputy Aaron Pike took one look at the launch, the drag mark, the life vest strap, and the bobcat still sitting there under the rack, and all of the sleep went out of his face. "You touched anything?" "No," Damon said. "Good." Aaron followed the drag line with his eyes and immediately signaled for the search pattern to start at the willows. The river patrol officer, a woman named Jess Miller with a dry suit half-zipped in river mud, still on her boots from last week's flood recovery, moved lower than the rest of them, reading the launch the way experienced water people read shorelines. Entry point, scramble, loss of balance, path of panic. Halfway to the willow edge, she stopped and pointed. There, a second, smaller drag sign where something had slid sideways off the sand and into the reeds. Then a sound came from inside the willow tangle. Not a cry, not a shout, a whistle, thin, weak, human. Claire closed her eyes for one terrible half-second because the sound was the purest kind of fear in a wild place. Somebody too tired or too frightened to call properly, trying to make whatever signal they still could. The bobcat's ears shot forward. Jess went in first. She moved through the willows with one hand clearing branches and the other ready near the trauma kit strap across her chest. Aaron followed from the land side. Damon and Claire held at the edge, every muscle in their bodies trying to move faster than their training allowed. The whistle came again. Closer now. Lower. Then Jess's voice from inside the reeds. "I've got a kid!" Everything after that happened in a rush of wet footsteps, branches snapping, radios shouting, and people making themselves useful. The boy was wedged in the mud pocket beneath the undercut root line just above the river's edge, where the current had probably pushed him after he clawed his way out of deeper water. He looked maybe 9, one arm wrapped around a drift root, one knee buried in the reeds, life vest gone except for the torn strap, lips blue, face gray with cold and shock. Alive, but only because the bank had caught him before the current could take him back out. Claire knew him the second they lifted him clear enough for the light to hit his face. Eli Harper, one of the kids from the Saturday beginner kayak camp 2 weeks earlier. Bright, restless, kept asking when he'd be allowed in the real fast water. She remembered his mother because she laughed too loudly at all his bad jokes and made him wear sunscreen all day. Eli should not have been at the river alone before dawn. Jess and Aaron carried him up through the reeds while the medic team met them at the sand. He was conscious enough to fight once, which everyone accepted as a good sign. Then he coughed river water, started crying through chattering teeth, and wouldn't stop saying, "I tried to get out." Claire knelt beside him as the medic wrapped him in blankets and checked his airway. "You did," she said. "You did get out." The story, when it came, was jagged and incomplete, and still enough to freeze every adult within earshot. Eli had snuck out before dawn with an older cousin to see the river in morning fog. There had been a small fishing skiff tied loose at the upstream private dock. The cousin dared him to climb in. He did. The boat slipped its line. The cousin jumped out and ran for help, or ran from blame. It wasn't clear yet. Eli drifted, panicked, hit the near current seam, and went over when the skiff struck the rock bar below the bend. The life vest he had stolen from his own garage and half-fastened tore loose as he fought for the bank. He dragged himself out at Cedar Bend's launch, and then farther into the willows because he heard footsteps on the road and thought he was in trouble, not realizing the people coming were exactly who he needed. And before any of them got there, a bobcat had sat beside the kayak rack and refused to leave until the right humans noticed the wrong marks in the sand. By the time the ambulance took Eli up the launch road toward town, the mist had started lifting off the river in torn white ribbons. The sun was still low enough that the launch remained mostly gray, but color had begun returning to things. Red kayaks, orange throw bags, blue sheriff lights, the torn vest strap still lying on the sand where Aaron had bagged it for evidence. The bobcat was still there. It stood now at the edge of the willows, body angled toward the departing ambulance, then toward the river. No one spoke for a second. Even the deputy, who had been all procedure and clipped questions since arrival, turned and looked at it the way people looked at things they could not file usefully. Claire had no language for what she felt except that the animal's presence had become woven into the truth of the morning so completely that imagining the rescue without it felt dishonest. The bobcat looked once into the reeds where the child had been. Then it slipped into the willow shadows and vanished along the riverbank so silently that if none of them had been watching together, each might have doubted the moment belonged to the real world. The rest of the day unraveled in the usual ugly practical ways. Sheriff's statements, calls to Eli's family, an officer sent upstream to deal with the cousin and the loose skiff, a formal closure of Cedar Bend's launch until the scene was processed, Damon giving the same short explanation to 3 different would-be customers before finally hanging a handwritten sign at the road, "Closed this morning." By noon, half the county knew some version of it. A bobcat at the kayak rack, fresh drag marks in the sand, a child in the reeds, a guide who looked because the cat wouldn't leave. The internet made it sentimental by afternoon. A local radio host called it nature's rescue instinct, which made Damon swear so creatively in the office that Claire had to leave the room laughing, despite everything. But when people who had actually been there told the story, they kept it plain. The bobcat waited by the river kayak rack. Then the guide saw the drag marks in the sand. That was enough. 2 mornings later, before the first lesson group, Claire walked down to the launch alone with her coffee and found herself stopping automatically at the rack. The sand had been smoothed by weather and boot traffic. The willow branches no longer held broken reeds where the boy had been pulled through. The river looked offensively innocent again. Then movement near the outer path caught her eye. A bobcat stood there in the weak dawn, framed between the first rack post and the river mist. Maybe the same one, maybe not. It looked toward the launch once, then toward her, then slipped into the reeds and was gone before she could do anything but stand still and watch the place where it had been.